Kyle stood in the doorway of our bedroom, arms crossed, watching me struggle to sit up against the pillows. I still had the surgical brace strapped around my lower back. I still had the faint bruise from the IV line on my left hand, and he said it like he was reading me a weather report. This Saturday, all 12 members of my family are staying at our house for 2 weeks. Have everything ready. I actually laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then I looked at his face. He wasn't joking. That was the moment I understood something had shifted in our marriage, and I hadn't been told. 5 days. That's how long it had been since Dr. Whitfield closed the incision along my spine, and told me in that flat, clinical voice doctors use when they want you to actually listen, that I needed a minimum of 4 weeks without lifting, without standing more than 15 minutes at a stretch, without climbing stairs more than once or twice a day. He'd handed me a printed sheet with the restrictions in bold. I still had it folded in my nightstand drawer, right next to the bottle of oxycodone I was trying to take as little of as possible. Kyle. I said, keeping my voice even because I'd learned a long time ago that raising it never got me anywhere with him. I just had surgery. Please, can we postpone it until next weekend? Even just a few days would help. He didn't look up from his phone. No one is waiting. Just do as I say. That sentence landed somewhere I didn't expect. Not in my chest where I thought hurt was supposed to live. It landed lower in my stomach, in the place where you feel something curdle. 22 years of marriage, and he'd never spoken to me quite like that before, not with that particular coldness, like I was an employee who'd asked for a day off during a busy season, and he was simply informing me the request was denied. I didn't argue. I've never been a woman who argues well in the moment. I need time to turn things over to look at them from every angle before I know what I actually think. So I just nodded, and he left the room satisfied, already texting his mother the arrival details I assumed, though I didn't ask. That night I lay awake long after Kyle's breathing evened out beside me. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, the blades catching the blue light from the street lamp outside our window. My back ached in that deep structural way that reminded me my body was still healing from something serious, something that had involved a surgeon cutting through muscle to reach bone. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself actually think about the last 2 decades, instead of just living through them. Every summer without fail, Kyle's family descended on our house like a small, cheerful army. His parents, George and Linda, who'd been married 50 years, and had opinions about everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to how I seasoned a roast. His brother Ethan, who'd said more than once, usually after his 3rd beer, that this house had always felt like the family house, as if that were a compliment and not a small act of erasure. Ethan's wife and their 2 teenagers. Kyle's younger sister and her husband, their toddler, who was admittedly adorable, but who also meant I spent 2 weeks cutting grapes into quarters and wiping down high chairs. 12 people for 2 weeks every single summer since Kyle and I got married. I did the math once years ago out of curiosity more than anything, and stopped when the number of hours started to feel like an accusation. I bought the groceries a specific list because Linda didn't eat gluten and George didn't eat anything spicy, and the teenagers apparently required a constant supply of a particular brand of string cheese. I made up the beds in the guest room and blew up the air mattresses for the overflow. I did the laundry mountains of it, towels and sheets that smelled like other people's homes. I drove to the airport. I planned the meals. I smiled in photographs where I was always the one standing slightly outside the frame, the one who'd just run back into the kitchen to check on something. Not once in 22 years had anyone asked if I was tired. Not once had anyone asked if the timing worked for me. It had simply always worked because I had simply always made it work the way water finds the lowest point and settles there without complaint. I thought about our daughter Chloe away at college now, probably asleep in some dorm room 3 states over, blissfully unaware that her mother was lying in the dark doing arithmetic on her own exhaustion. I thought about the promise I'd made to myself in the hospital recovery room, groggy from anesthesia, when I'd told myself that this surgery was going to be the thing that finally slowed me down, finally made me protect myself the way I'd spent 2 decades protecting everyone else. I reached for the bottle of pain medication on the nightstand, shook out 1 pill, then set it back down without taking it. I wanted my head clear. Instead, I reached past it for my laptop, the screen throwing pale light across the blanket, across the brace, still cinched around my middle. I wasn't checking recipes. I wasn't building a grocery list or looking up which hotel might have a crib for the baby. For the first time in my marriage, I opened the folder containing the deed to our house. The deed was exactly where I remembered it, tucked into a manila folder in the fireproof box my father had bought decades ago, back when he still worried about things like fires and floods and the ordinary disasters of life. I hadn't opened that box in years. There was no reason to. But that night, with Kyle asleep beside me and my back throbbing in slow, deliberate waves, I carried my laptop and a small flashlight into the hallway bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the closed toilet lid reading paperwork like it was a novel I couldn't put down. My parents bought this house in 1994. I grew up in it, in the room that later became my daughter's nursery, then her bedroom, then the guest room where Kyle's mother slept every summer without ever once thanking me for the fresh sheets. When my father passed 8 years ago, and my mother followed 2 years after him, the house came to me. Not to me and Kyle. To me. I remembered signing papers at the lawyer's office, remembered Kyle sitting beside me that day, distracted, checking his phone, saying, "That's great, honey," without really looking up. He'd never asked to see the deed. He'd never needed to. In his mind, from the day we moved our furniture back into my childhood home, it simply became our house. And somewhere in that quiet grammatical shift, my ownership dissolved into something communal, something he felt entitled to open up to 12 relatives without asking me first. I read every page twice. The language was plain, almost startling in its clarity. Sole owner. My name and only my name printed beneath my father's signature and the notary's seal. I sat there in the bathroom at 1 a.m, my knees pulled up awkwardly, because bending my spine still hurt, and felt something in me settle. Not anger exactly, something steadier than anger, clarity maybe. The next morning after Kyle left for work, I called Diane Foster, the attorney who'd handled my parents' estate. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but she remembered me right away, remembered the little jar of homemade jam I'd brought to her office out of gratitude after the estate closed. I told her everything: the surgery, the 12 relatives, Kyle's flat refusal to even consider postponing. She listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, letting me talk myself all the way to the point. "Melissa," she said finally, "let me ask you something. Whose name is on the deed?" "Mine," I said. "Just mine." "Then legally, you have full authority over who occupies that property and under what conditions. Your husband doesn't need to co-sign a decision about your own home. You're not asking permission, you're informing him." I sat with that for a long moment, the phone warm against my ear. "I don't want to hurt him," I said, and I meant it. Whatever else was true, I hadn't stopped loving Kyle. I just didn't know anymore if he'd stopped seeing me. "This isn't about hurting anyone," Diane said, and her voice softened in a way that told me she'd had this conversation with other women before, maybe many times. "You had major surgery 5 days ago. Your doctor gave you explicit restrictions. You are not obligated to host anyone, family or otherwise, while you're recovering. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty, Melissa. It's the bare minimum of taking care of yourself. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty." I wrote it down on a sticky note and pressed it to the edge of my laptop where I'd see it every time I opened the screen. We talked for another 20 minutes about logistics, what I could legally do, what documentation I'd need, how to handle things cleanly, and without leaving room for anyone to claim I'd acted out of spite. Diane was careful about that last part. "Paper trail," she kept saying. "Everything in writing, everything defensible." I appreciated that she never once asked me to reconsider, never once suggested I was overreacting. She treated my exhaustion as a fact, not a feeling to be managed. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking out at the backyard where George always set up his folding chair in the one patch of shade where Linda liked to inspect my flower beds and offer unsolicited advice about mulch. I thought about the 4 weeks of recovery ahead of me, the physical therapy appointments already on the calendar, the simple fact that I could barely carry a laundry basket without wincing, let alone cook 3 meals a day for a dozen people. I wasn't plotting revenge. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell this story as though I sat there scheming, rubbing my hands together like some cartoon villain. That wasn't it at all. I was tired and scared of my own body's limits for maybe the first time in my adult life, and I was starting slowly to understand that the house I'd grown up in, the house my father had left me, didn't have to be a place where I disappeared into service every summer. I opened a fresh document on my laptop and began making a list. Not a grocery list, not a cleaning schedule, a plan. By Thursday, I had 3 phone calls scheduled, and I made every single one of them from the quiet of my car parked in the pharmacy lot, 2 miles from the house. My seat reclined just enough to keep the pressure off my lower back. I didn't want Kyle walking past and overhearing. Not because I was hiding anything illegal. Diane had been very clear that everything I was about to do was well within my rights, but because I needed to finish what I was building before he had the chance to talk me out of it the way he always managed to, with that particular tone he used when he wanted something, and had decided my resistance was just a formality to be waited out. The first call was to a company called Buckeye Restoration, an interior renovation outfit that handled everything from water damage to full remodels. I told the woman on the phone, a brisk, efficient sort named Patricia, that I needed a full interior assessment and restoration, quote, flooring paint, some drywall work in the upstairs hallway where an old water stain had never quite been addressed. All true, incidentally. I'd been meaning to fix that stain for 2 years. Patricia said she could send a 3-person crew out Saturday morning first thing, and that the work would likely take 2 weeks given the scope. 2 weeks. I felt something in my chest unclench slightly at the words. The second call went to a heating and cooling company for an emergency inspection of the central air system, which actually had been making an odd rattling noise for about a month. I wasn't lying about that either. I was simply choosing for the first time in my marriage to prioritize my own house's actual needs over my own exhaustion in service of everyone else's comfort. The third call was to a painting company Diane had recommended, one she said was reliable about honoring contract terms, including the standard clause about occupancy during active work, no residents on the premises during interior painting, and floor refinishing for safety and liability reasons. That clause was the whole point. I had it read back to me twice. By Saturday morning, all 3 crews were scheduled to arrive between 8 and 9. I'd already contacted my insurance company, who confirmed that, under my recovery plan, I qualified for a short-term stay at a rehabilitation apartment complex about 15 minutes from the house, a place with grab bars in the bathroom, a single-level layout, and a nurse who did wellness checks twice a week. I hadn't mentioned this option to Kyle because he hadn't asked. Not once in 5 days had he asked where I planned to actually recover while hosting 12 people. I packed a bag Friday night while Kyle was at his brother's house, presumably finalizing arrival logistics. I moved slowly, the brace creaking faintly with each motion, folding just enough clothes for 2 weeks. My medications, the folder with my post-surgical instructions, my laptop, the framed photo of my parents that had sat on our dresser for years. I left a note on the kitchen counter, not dramatic, just factual. Gone to recovery housing per doctor's orders. House is closed for scheduled renovation work beginning Saturday. Contractors have keys. Please don't interfere with their schedule. It's a liability issue with the insurance. I drove myself to the rehab apartment Friday night, wincing every time I hit a pothole, and slept better than I had in 5 days. Saturday morning, I wasn't there to see it, but Kyle told me about it later in pieces in the weeks that followed, and I've stitched the account together from what he and eventually Linda admitted. 3 SUVs pulled into our driveway around 10 that morning, packed with suitcases, coolers, folding beach chairs, a cooler specifically for the seafood Ethan's wife insisted on bringing every year. 12 people spilled out onto the lawn, chattering, already discussing who'd sleep where. And there, taped to the front door at eye level, were 2 printed signs, laminated, so they wouldn't curl in the humidity. Home closed for renovation. No occupancy until further notice. Per contractor and insurance requirements. Behind the signs, through the front windows, they could see the crew already inside, a man in coveralls, sanding down the hallway floor, plastic sheeting draped over the living room furniture, the unmistakable chemical smell of primer already seeping out through the screen door, Kyle later admitted he'd tried uselessly to pry open. Kyle stood on the porch, according to Linda, for what she described as a very long time, just staring at the sign like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. Patricia's crew foreman came to the door polite but firm and explained that the property was under an active service contract, prohibiting occupancy during the work standard liability protocol. Nothing personal, sir, just company policy and the terms of the agreement. Kyle called me 4 times before I even turned my phone back on. When I finally did, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed in my rehab apartment, I watched the missed call notifications stack up on the screen one after another, like something building toward a wave. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt mostly a strange and unfamiliar calm, the particular quiet of a woman who has, for the first time in 2 decades, made a decision entirely for herself and is bracing gently for what comes next. I let the 4th call from Kyle go to voicemail before I finally picked up on the 5th. His voice came through sharp and clipped, none of the smoothness he usually carried like a second skin. "What did you do? No greeting, no, how are you feeling?" Just that, like an accusation dropped on the table between us. I kept my voice level the way I'd practiced in my head more than once over the past few days. "Exactly what my surgeon asked me to do, Kyle. I'm recovering from major surgery. I can't host 12 people right now. I told you that. You said no one was waiting. Melissa, my parents are standing on the porch. Ethan's kids are asking why we can't go inside. Do you understand what you've done? I understand I hired a licensed contractor to do work my house has needed for 2 years," I said. "I understand my insurance is covering my recovery housing. I understand I told you 5 days ago that I needed you to postpone this trip, and you told me no one was waiting." There was a silence on the line that felt longer than it probably was. Then he hung up. Linda called next, and I almost didn't answer, but some old habit of politeness, or maybe just curiosity about what she'd say, made me pick up. Her voice was tight with the particular fury of a woman used to getting her way through sheer persistence. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? We drove 6 hours. The children are exhausted. This is completely selfish of you, Melissa, completely She caught herself before finishing the word, but I heard it anyway, heard the shape of it in her throat. Each key, selfish. As though a woman 5 days out from spinal surgery asking not to host a house full of relatives was the height of selfishness, and not the years she'd spent accepting my labor as though it were simply weather, simply something that happened rather than something I did. I didn't argue with her. I'd learned over 2 decades that arguing with Linda was like trying to hold water in your hands. The more you gripped, the faster it slipped through. Instead, I texted her a photo of my discharge paperwork, the surgeon's restrictions printed in bold at the bottom. No lifting over 10 pounds, no standing longer than 15 minutes, minimum 4 weeks recovery. Then I texted simply, "This is why. I hope you all find comfortable arrangements." And I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and didn't look at it again that day. George's voicemail came through later that evening, his tone booming, even through the phone's tinny speaker. Something about how I'd made the whole family look foolish. How a wife doesn't just disappear when her husband needs her. I listened to it once, then deleted it, and found that my hands weren't even shaking. I'd expected to feel shaken. Instead, I felt like someone who'd finally set down a piece of furniture she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten her arms could ache from something other than that specific weight. Kyle, meanwhile, was navigating a crisis I'd spent 22 summers quietly managing without him ever noticing the machinery behind it. 12 people needed somewhere to sleep, and nothing was available at the Reasonable Inn on Route 9. Apparently, there was a wedding that weekend, so he ended up booking rooms at the Marriott near the interstate 2 hours before check-in even opened, at a rate that I later learned from. The one time he made the mistake of complaining about it, within earshot of Ethan, came to just under $4,000 for the full 2 weeks, not counting meals. I heard through the fragments Kyle let slip in the days that followed how the week unfolded for him. He was the one who had to figure out at 9 at night what a family of 12 wanted for dinner, only to discover that George didn't like the Italian place Kyle had picked, and Linda's stomach couldn't handle the Mexican restaurant Ethan suggested as a compromise, and the toddler needed a specific brand of crackers that wasn't sold at the gas station convenience store, where Kyle ended up exhausted at 10 p.m. He was the one driving his parents to the pharmacy for George's blood pressure medication, which they'd forgotten, and driving Ethan's teenagers to the outlet mall because they were bored and fielding a dozen small requests that used to simply resolve themselves before he even noticed them as requests, because I had always resolved them first. I wasn't there to see any of it, but I could picture it with unsettling clarity, because I'd lived it myself for 22 summers, invisible and unthanked. There was something almost meditative about not being the one solving it this time. I spent my days at the rehab apartment doing the exercises my physical therapist had given me, short, careful walks down the hallway, ice on my back in the evenings, reading a novel I'd started 8 months ago, and never finished, because there was never quiet enough in my own house to hold a thought for longer than 10 minutes. On the third night, I lay on the narrow bed listening to the hum of the air conditioner, and I let myself feel for the first time without guilt trailing behind it like a shadow, something close to peace. I wasn't punishing anyone. I kept telling myself that, and mostly I believed it. I was simply finally not disappearing. By the 5th day, something in Kyle's texts started to shift. The first 2 days had been all accusation, capital letters, exclamation points, a barely restrained fury I recognized from the rare arguments we'd had over the years, always about money, or his mother never about me. But by Wednesday, the tone changed. "Long day?" He texted, no punctuation, no complaint attached to it, just those 2 flat words sent at 11 at night. Thursday, "Mom wants steak for dinner, but Dad says no red meat since his cholesterol appointment. Can't win." I didn't respond to either. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I simply didn't have an answer for him yet, and I'd stopped believing it was my job to always have one. By the end of that first week, I heard from Chloe, who'd apparently gotten an earful from her grandmother about the whole situation, and called me sounding more amused than alarmed. "Mom," she said, laughing into the phone, "Grandma Linda called me asking if I could talk some sense into you. I told her you just had spine surgery and she should probably talk some sense into herself." I laughed too, the first real laugh I'd had in nearly a week, and something in my chest loosened at the sound of my daughter defending me without my even asking. Kyle called on the 6th day, and this time his voice sounded different, worn down at the edges, none of the sharpness from that first call. "The kids are cranky. Mom's complaining the hotel pillows are too firm. Dad wants to know why we can't just go stay at Ethan's place instead, and Ethan says his house isn't big enough, which, Melissa, it's not big enough for 4 people, let alone 12, but somehow our house was always supposed to be." He stopped himself like he'd surprised himself by saying it out loud. "I've been doing the grocery runs every morning. Linda has an opinion about literally every single item. I didn't realize how much—" He didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't finish it for him. That was the moment I opened the spreadsheet I'd kept for 15 years. I want to explain what that spreadsheet was because it wasn't born out of bitterness, not originally. I'd started it back when Chloe was in elementary school, mostly to track our household budget, grocery costs, utility bills, the ordinary bookkeeping of a family trying to save for a daughter's college fund. But somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, I'd started logging the summer visits too, not out of any grand plan, just the same instinct that made me keep receipts for everything else. Groceries during the 2-week visits always noticeably higher than our normal weeks. The spike in the water and electric bills every July. The cost of the air mattresses we'd replaced twice because the teenagers punctured them. The new mattress in the guest room after George's back trouble required something firmer. The rental car we'd covered 1 year when Ethan's transmission gave out mid-visit, and he just needed a little help getting back on his feet. The airfare we'd quietly paid for Linda and George 3 separate times when their retirement account, as George put it, was a little tight that year. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rehab apartment and added it all up slowly, carefully, the way you'd count something you'd been avoiding counting for a long time. The number that appeared at the bottom of the column made me sit back in my chair. $185,412. Over 22 years. Groceries, utilities, repairs, mattresses, the rental car, the airfare, the endless small accommodations that had never once been reciprocated, never once even been acknowledged as a cost rather than an obligation. I didn't cry, though I thought I might. Instead, I felt something colder and clearer settle over me, the same sensation I imagine a surgeon must feel studying an X-ray before an operation, not anger exactly, but a kind of precise, unemotional clarity about the shape of the problem in front of her. I thought about Kyle's voice on the phone that afternoon, worn thin after less than a week of doing what I'd done for 2 decades without complaint. I thought about how quickly the family story about me, selfish, ungrateful, difficult, had assembled itself the moment I stopped absorbing the cost of their comfort. Nobody had asked what it cost me. Nobody had asked not once in 22 years whether I was tired, whether I was well, whether I wanted a summer that didn't revolve around service. I closed the laptop, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I began to think not about defending myself, but about being seen. Not through anger, through evidence. There's a particular kind of quiet a person carries when they've decided finally to stop explaining themselves and simply show the math instead. I spent the final days of my 2 weeks preparing something I'd never made before in my life, a presentation about my own marriage. It felt strange sitting at that small kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of printer paper I'd bought at the drugstore down the street, formatting years of receipts and bank statements into something that could be read at a glance the way you'd prepare a report for a boardroom rather than a family. But that's essentially what it had become: 22 years of unpaid, unacknowledged labor laid out in black and white. I titled the cover page simply 22 Years of Hospitality. Underneath in smaller text the total $185,412. Then page by page the breakdown 2004 through this year, groceries during summer visits itemized against our normal monthly averages. The spike in utilities every July circled in red. The replacement air mattresses, the guest room mattress, the rental car, the 3 years of airfare for George and Linda. I included photographs too, ones I'd taken over the years without any particular purpose beyond documentation. Linda in the kitchen, I'd stalked George asleep in the recliner. I'd bought specifically because his back needed the support, the receipts themselves scanned and dated undeniable. I called Kyle on what would have been the last day of the visit, and asked him to gather everyone at the house that evening. The renovation crew had finished 2 days early, the floors gleaming, the hallway wall finally free of its water stain, the air conditioning running quiet and even for the first time in months. He agreed, sounding cautious, maybe even relieved that I was finally engaging again after 2 weeks of near silence. I arrived that evening still moving carefully, the brace loosened slightly now that I was 6 days further into recovery, and found all 12 of them gathered in the living room, perched on furniture that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. I could see it on their faces the moment I walked in, the assumption worn openly that I'd come to apologize, to explain myself, maybe to cry a little, and let them comfort me back into my old role. Linda even stood up, arms half raised as though preparing for the kind of embrace that precedes forgiveness. I didn't sit down. I distributed the folders instead, one to each person, moving slowly around the room, saying nothing until everyone had one in their lap. Then I stood by the fireplace, the same spot where I'd stood in 100 Christmas photos over the years, always slightly out of frame, and I let them read the cover page in silence. Linda's face changed first, then George's. Ethan flipped through the pages faster than the others, his jaw tightening with each one landing on the photograph of the rental car receipt from the year his transmission failed. "Can anyone name one vacation?" I said, my voice steady, quieter than I expected it to come out, where I was treated like a guest instead of the maid. Nobody answered. The room had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it. "Can anyone remember?" I continued, asking whether I was healthy enough, or rested enough, or simply willing before inviting yourselves into my home for 2 weeks at a time every single summer for 22 years. Still nothing. Kyle sat on the arm of the sofa, staring down at his own folder, and I watched something happen in his face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Not defensiveness, not the reflexive loyalty to his family that I'd grown so used to. Something closer to recognition. "I'm not asking for the money back," I said, and I meant it. "I'm not interested in being repaid." I kept this because somewhere along the way I stopped being able to trust my own sense of what was fair. I needed to see it written down to believe it myself. I looked at Linda specifically because I think some part of me needed her of all of them to understand. I have loved having this family in my life. I have never once loved being invisible in my own house. George cleared his throat like he might say something, but nothing came out. Ethan closed his folder and set it on the coffee table, his ears red. Linda sat back down slowly, the folder still open on her lap to the photograph of herself in my kitchen, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked less like a woman preparing an argument and more like a woman confronting an accounting she hadn't expected to face. I didn't wait for an apology that evening. I didn't think one was coming, not yet, and I'd stopped needing it to arrive on any particular schedule. I simply gathered my things, told Kyle I'd see him at home once the paint smell cleared from the guest room, and drove myself back to the rehab apartment for one more night, the folder of my own labor sitting finally in someone else's hands instead of mine. I moved back into the house 11 days after I'd left it, walking through rooms that smelled faintly of fresh paint instead of the usual chaos of a family visit winding down. The hallway floor gleamed under new varnish. The air conditioning hummed evenly, no more rattling. It felt oddly like moving into a version of my own home that had been waiting for me all along, just underneath the version I'd been living in for 22 years. Kyle and I didn't have some big dramatic conversation that first night. That's not how real repair works. I've come to understand, not in one sweeping speech, but in 100 small adjustments made quietly over time. What we did have a few days later, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, was a conversation I'd been waiting half my marriage to have. "I didn't know it added up to that much," he said, turning his mug slowly in his hands. "Not just the money, all of it. The driving, the meals, the I didn't know because I never had to know. You always just handled it." "I know," I said, and I wasn't trying to make him feel worse. I was just telling the truth the way I'd promised myself I would from now on, even when it was uncomfortable. "I'm not going to pretend those 2 weeks weren't awful," he admitted, a small, tired laugh escaping him. "My mother complained about hotel pillows for 4 straight days. I don't think I slept more than 5 hours a night the entire time." He looked up at me, then something more honest in his face than I'd seen from him in years. "But I understand now. I actually understand Melissa. I don't think I ever really did before. We agreed that week on something we should have agreed on years earlier: no more open-door policy. No more assuming the house belonged to whoever wanted it, whenever they wanted it. Any future visit from his family or mine for that matter, though my side had always been smaller, quieter, easier, would require both of our agreement in advance, and would come with clear expectations. Guests would help with groceries. Guests would clean up after themselves. Guests would not treat me as staff simply because I happened to know where everything was kept. The real test came about 6 weeks later at a smaller family dinner, just Kyle's parents this time invited properly with 2 weeks' notice and an explicit conversation beforehand about what the visit would look like. George arrived stiff and formal, clearly still smarting from the folder I'd handed him, and made a point of complimenting the renovated hallway in a tone that suggested he was trying very hard to find something safe to say. Linda, for her part, brought a casserole dish, something she had never once done in 22 years of visits, and set it on the counter with a kind of careful deliberateness, as though placing an offering. Partway through dinner, Ethan called Kyle's phone. He hadn't been invited this time, something Kyle and I had discussed and agreed on together, and I heard Kyle's voice shift into something firmer than I was used to hearing him use with his brother. "No, Ethan, not this time. We're keeping it small. You're welcome to visit, but you'll need to plan it with us in advance, same as anyone else." I looked up from the stove, surprised, and found Kyle watching me, checking. I think whether he'd said the right thing. I nodded just slightly, and he nodded back. Later that evening, after his parents left, George paused at the door and said gruffly, not quite looking at me, "House looks good. The floor." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. But it was George Roberts acknowledging something out loud that he'd have once considered beneath him to notice, and I decided to let that be enough for now. It was Kyle, though, who surprised me most. A few nights later, we were in the kitchen and I overheard him on the phone with his father, his voice calm, but unmistakably firm. "Dad, I need you to understand something. This is Melissa's home too, actually. If we're being precise about it, it was her home before it was ever mine. I should have remembered that years ago, and I didn't, and that's on me, not her." There was a pause, George's voice rumbling indistinctly on the other end, and then Kyle said simply, "I'm not arguing about it anymore. That's just how it's going to be." I stood in the doorway with a dish towel in my hands, listening to my husband defend me to his father for what might have been the first time in our entire marriage, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for longer than I'd realized. Months passed. Autumn came, and with it the ordinary rhythms of our life. Chloe home for a long weekend, the leaves turning along our street, my back finally fully healed, the brace long since packed away in the closet. Then one Tuesday evening in October my phone rang, and it was Linda. I almost didn't answer out of old habit more than anything. But I did, and her voice when it came was different than I expected, smaller, almost tentative, nothing like the commanding tone I'd known for 2 decades. "Melissa," she said, "I was wondering, would next Saturday be a good time to visit just for the afternoon? I'd call ahead, of course, and bring something for lunch if that's all right with you." I smiled, standing alone in my kitchen, the late afternoon light coming gold through the window over the sink. It wasn't an apology. Linda Roberts, I suspected, would never quite manage the words themselves, but it was something I'd waited 22 years to hear a woman who had once treated my home as a birthright, now asking gently, humbly, if she might be allowed to knock. "Saturday would be lovely, Linda," I said. "I'll see you then. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever given so much of yourself that people forgot to ask whether you had anything left to give, I hope this story reminded you that it's never too late to be seen." I'd love to know where this story found you tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know what city you're watching from. I read every single one. We have new stories like this waiting for you every day, so subscribe now so you never miss a moment like this one. Let's keep this journey going together.